Welcome to the show. My name is Charlton with Big C. This is Charlton and Big C Sports, coming to you worldwide on the Big C Sports Network, on the #1 network in the United States of America. And Big C Sports has been voted the #1 sports show in the universe, according to Big C. And them good old boys down south, I want to say bienvenidos to all of our listeners in Latin America, also across the pond in London, England, as well as Paris, France. Of course, you good old boys in Canada, we love you. In Africa, the Big C Drive. But there's no one we love more than the good old boys down south in the land of the free and the home of the brave on a beautiful December the 11th, 2019. Grande Deportes, Big C. How's it going for you good old boys down south?
Charlton, sitting down here in a beautiful winter's day in the south. Woke up this morning, it was chilly and windy and everything. Then the sun broke out this afternoon, and there's not a speck of snow in sight.
That's because it all came over to the West Coast, Big C. There's a little bit of snow up in the Sierra Nevadas, lots of rain in Northern California. But we need the rain. We just need people to drive safe. I want to say today's show is sponsored by your Northern California Cadillac dealers, home of the all-new Cadillac Escalade, the standard of the world. And when you go by and test drive yours, tell them Charlton and Big C sent you. Also, Big C Sports, powered by Google and Alexa. Just say Google or Alexa, play Big C Sports Podcast. You'll hear from our sponsors. You'll hear welcome to the show. I will introduce Big C as the Mystic, and he'll do his thing, and I really appreciate the way things are going with Big C Sports. You can also follow Big C Sports on Xfinity, Comcast Television, launching on Roku TV, Apple TV, Fire TV, and a lot of smart TVs all over the universe. Really appreciate the way things are going. Also, Big C, I know we get into this time of year. Everybody's looking for something to buy for the holidays. Can't remember what they bought last year, Big C. And I know a lot of veterans still want to make sure that they are not ignored. 800-273-8255, 800-273-8255. Also, they can text 838-255. That's 838-255, because people also need help. Big C, your thoughts?
Well, the National Suicide Prevention Hotline number, Charlton, is something that's synonymous with our show and something we begin our show with every day to show our appreciation and care about our great veterans in this country, Charlton. So many of our veterans have succumbed to suicide, some 20 a day in America, because they have nowhere to turn to. They feel there's no outlook on life, Charlton, after they've served this country admirably and come back home and the things are not the way that they should be. This country turns their backs on our veterans when they're out of sight and out of mind, and the Suicide Prevention Hotline number, Charlton, is there for them to have a shoulder and a voice to lean on. Someone who is non-judgmental that will talk to them, to be careful about their concerns.
Yep.
Not thinking about themselves, but of the veterans, which we all as Americans need to think about every day. When we think about this horrific disease that's called suicide, we don't see any national organizations talking about suicide prevention, Charlton, how we stem the tide of that. And our veterans are suffering from it every day, as well as the layman members of society.
Yeah.
But the Suicide Prevention Hotline number, Charlton, is there for those people who have served, who have been thoughtful of the people that they don't even know in America. When you go off to war, you don't know the people that you're fighting for. You know that they're just American citizens.
Yep.
And we have to think of our veterans in that light. We don't have to know them personally. Just think about all that they sacrificed for our sovereignty.
Yeah, just think about it and give some help to people when they need it. 800-273-8255. That's 800-273-8255. Or they can text 838-255. That's 838-255 and get some help. Also, civilians can use that same number. Want to appreciate iHeartRadio, Big C Sports, one of the top podcast programs they have in their network. Really appreciate that. I want to make sure that as this time of year is so exciting, especially when we talk about NFL football. Of course, college football is there too. But I want to try something a little bit different today, Big C. We know we can do a lot of games over and over again. But I want to get your thoughts on the greatest players in the history of each NFL franchise. And everybody has their own opinion, just like we all have our own flavor of Kool-Aid. But the greatest NFL players of each franchise. I'm going to start with number 32 actually, the Arizona Cardinals. And I'm going to get your thoughts on who those players might be. If it just comes to mind, top 2 players in the history of the Arizona Cardinals. Big C, who's on the top of your mind, your thoughts?
Well, Charlton, everybody is always thinking about the modern-day player that they see playing every day now. But, you know, as I think about the two most dominant players in the history of the Arizona Cardinals, formerly the St. Louis Cardinals, Charlton, I have to go back to when they were in St. Louis, and I think about quarterback Jim Hart, who was the flagship of that franchise when they were in the gateway of America in St. Louis. And since their move to the desert in Arizona, I look at Larry Fitzgerald. And you have to choose between one of these players, Larry Fitzgerald, who is the NFL's number 2 all-time leading receiver, and Jim Hart. I would say that Larry Fitzgerald is the all-time best Cardinal player.
And especially he has a Super Bowl championship, too. Not a championship, but he had a Super Bowl appearance with the Arizona Cardinals when they ran up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. So, obviously, I don't think many people would disagree with that. But let me bring it to franchise number 31 spot. That would be the Atlanta Falcons, and they have a history of so many great players. You know, they've had 3 different stadiums to play in the last 3 decades. Also a Big C, Fulton County Stadium, the Georgia Dome, now Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Who would be the top 2 players that are synonymous with the greatest all-time for the Atlanta Falcons? Big C, your thoughts?
I mean, this is a franchise rich in history that many people are not aware of. You think about Tommy Novus, their original number 1 draft pick, middle linebacker. Claude Humphrey, 2-time All-Pro Hall of Fame defensive end that they had. And if you look at the modern-day Falcons, Charlton, you're going to look at Matt Ryan, who just eclipsed 50,000 yards in passing. Julio Jones, one of the most dominant receivers in NFL history. I would have to lean towards Claude Humphrey. Claude Humphrey played in a time when the Falcons were there and no one really knew about it, but he was that consistent perennial All-Pro, Charlton. He was a dominant defensive end, had over 100 career sacks. You know, in his NFL career, I take Claude Humphrey.
If I were to ask you who's ever had the most expensive earrings for the Atlanta Falcons, might be Deion Sanders, but no, he would be trumped by the great Julio Jones. We go to the Baltimore Ravens, and this is a franchise that's on top of the NFL universe. Again, they've been there many, many times before. But the Baltimore Ravens, you think about their history and how the Baltimore Colts left out of Baltimore, the Ravens replaced them as a franchise. Give me your thoughts, Big C's thoughts, the best 2 Baltimore Ravens of all time, your thoughts.
You know, this is a franchise, as you say, been to 2 Super Bowls, 2 Super Bowl victories, Charlton. At that first Super Bowl, they were led by Jamal Lewis, a 2,000-yard rusher, but the defense was prominent. Ray Lewis led the defense. You think about his counterpart on defense, Ed Reed. These 2 players were the most synonymous players in Ravens history, but I'm going to give the nod to Ray Lewis, one of the most dominant middle linebackers in NFL history.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people would doubt that. Imagine they were dominant in Miami and were just as dominant as they got to the NFL. Big C, very good thought. Again, everybody has their own opinion, but I want to take you to Orchard Park, New York, number 29 on our list, the Buffalo Bills. I know the Juice ran for 2,000 yards when he was running like a buffalo through the snow, Big C, but give me your thoughts on this team that's been to 4 Super Bowl championships but came away empty. Your thoughts on the top 2 Bills of all time?
When you think about a team with a host of Hall of Famers, you talked about O.J., the first 2,000-yard rusher in NFL history, Hall of Fame running back. Thurman Thomas, Hall of Fame running back. Andre Reed, Hall of Fame wide receiver. Jim Kelly, though, was the trigger man behind those 4 Super Bowls. You think about Bruce Smith, NFL all-time leading sacker. But I'm going to have to go with Jim Kelly. Jim Kelly, to me, no quarterback has gone to 4 consecutive Super Bowls. Even though he did not win, you think about that feat. 4 consecutive Super Bowls and into the Hall of Fame. Jim Kelly is the all-time great Buffalo Bill.
And he's also been fighting for his health. And he's been fighting all of his life, Big C. I want to see him win that battle as well. Just a great person, Big C, the great Jim Kelly. Also, as we stay to the East Coast, or some people call it the South, Carolina Panthers coming in as the number 28 franchise. Everybody talks about the Superman, and he can fly. We know they just got rid of Coach Ron Rivera. They have been to a couple of Super Bowls with this young franchise, Big C. Give me your thoughts on who are the top 2 players all time for the Carolina Panthers.
Well, this is a program, Charlton, that hasn't been around the NFL forever, but you think about the success that they've had in the short term that they've been around. 2 Super Bowl appearances, Charlton. You got to look at where this team is. Steve Smith, I think, is the most underrated wide receiver to have played in the NFL. And then I think about Luke Kuechly, the linebacker out of Boston College with the Carolina Panthers. But I'm going to go with Steve Smith, a perennial All-Pro, kick returner and wide receiver. Still the Panthers' all-time leading receiver after he left him with the Baltimore and retired.
And he's still doing his thing in media also. Really appreciate him. He wasn't a big in stature, but he had a heart the size of a lion, Big C. I want to go up north. You know it's cold up north, Big C. The Windy City, Chicago. Not windy because it's so windy and cold. Windy for politics, but it's all fair on the football field. We think about sweetness. We think about refrigerator pairing. The great Gale Sears, Big C. But when you go to Chicago, Michael Jordan ranks as maybe the best Chicago athlete of all time. But on the gridiron, we have so many great players. We know we have the 85 Bears, that great defense. So many people, so many characters. Give me Big C's thoughts on the top 2 Bears of all time.
Well, when you look at the Bears, it's so difficult to go through. You mentioned Gale Sears, Mike Dick, who revolutionized the position of tight end in the NFL. Just a great group of players, Dalton. Mike Singletary, one of the most dominant middle linebackers, part of that Bears 85 defense.
Yeah.
But when you talk about sweetness, this man is synonymous with the NFL. Everybody recognizes him just on the one word, sweetness. The greatest Chicago Bear of all time.
Yeah, sweetness. And we talked about over the years, guys that stayed in shape all the time. Jerry Rice, known for running the hill out in San Francisco Bay Area. Well, Sweetness also ran a lot of hills too, Big C. Just a giant of a man, Big C. I want to stay in the North, Midwest even, Cincinnati Bengals. And they had so many different players, different personality types. Chad Ochocinco, I remember him. They had the guy that I think his name was Iggy Dance, Iggy Woods, Big C, out of Edison High School, Fresno, and also UNLV. So they had the Iggy Shuffle. He brought that to the Super Bowl. Also the Cincinnati Bengals. But that's a team. They've changed their helmets. They've gone. Now they have a lot of stripes, Big C. I thought a Bengal didn't change his stripes, Big C. Your thoughts on the best all-time 2 players? Your thoughts?
Well, this is the team that Paul Brown formed after he left the Cleveland Browns, another team that he formed, Charlton. One owner formed 2 NFL franchises.
Yeah.
But when I think about this team, Charlton, and it's made multiple Super Bowl appearances also, 2 players come to mind. I think about Kenny Anderson, quarterback who took them to their first Super Bowl in 1983, Charlton, when they lost in Detroit.
Yeah.
But I go with the great offensive tackle, Anthony Munoz, the #1 draft pick out of USC, NFL Hall of Famer.
Yep.
One of the most dominant, massive offensive linemen we've ever seen in the modern era.
Moeller High School, Cincinnati's finest. Munoz obviously can block anybody, Big C. As we stay in the great state of Ohio, LeBron James has made it great for the NBA basketball franchise, but then football is still what Cleveland is. I know they have the franchise, baseball franchise, the Indians, but when you think about some of the greatest players that have ever played NFL football, they also played in probably the ugliest uniforms in the NFL. Who would be the top 2 players in Cleveland Brown history, Big C? Your thoughts?
Well, when you think about the Cleveland Browns, Charlton, and how dominant a franchise that they were in the 50s and 60s in the NFL, I know a lot of people think about the current Browns and the most notable quarterback they would have had, they think would have been Bernie Kosar. But when I think about the 2 most dominant players in the Cleveland Brown history, Charlton, I think about Otto Graham. Otto Graham has won more professional football titles than any quarterback in NFL history. He is 7 out of 10. People think Tom Brady's won the most 6 out of 9. Otto Graham was 7 out of 10 as a quarterback with the Cleveland Browns. But many people think this guy is the greatest running back of all time in the NFL. Jim Brown.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm going to go with Jim Brown because he changed the position of running back. He made it a notable position in the NFL that everyone had to recognize.
They had to recognize. You know how LeBron James came from the Cleveland Cavaliers down to the Miami Heat, now back to Cleveland, and now currently with the LA Lakers. And people say, well, LeBron's coming to LA, advantage of opportunities and make movies. Well, the great Jim Brown did it first, Big C. 2 statuesque figures of a person and very intelligent man. I don't think anyone would disagree on the great Jim Brown. I want to take it to America's favorite team. And America's favorite team has been through so much up and down over the last 2 decades, Big C, but they have that star on the side of the helmet, and the stars shine bright deep in the night in the heart of Texas. I have so much respect for this franchise. They're the #1 franchise in the NFL. They've had a couple of owners and they probably had the most famous owner in the NFL, going back to guys like Ed Too Tall Jones, Tony Dorsett. I mean, you can't name them all on one hand, Big C. Give me Big C's thoughts on the top 2 Dallas Cowboys of all time.
Well, when you think about Dallas Cowboys, it's such a rich history with this organization. You think about Bob Lilly, the great defensive tackle, out of TCU, hometown boy who spent his career in Dallas. You think about the quarterbacks they had, Troy Aikman, leading his team to 2 Super Bowls.
Oh, yeah.
You think about 3 Super Bowls. Roger Staubach did it first, leading them to 3 Super Bowls. But I got to go with Emmitt Smith, the NFL's all-time leading rusher. I got to make him the greatest Dallas Cowboy of all time.
Isn't that amazing? A good old boy from I think Escambia, Florida. Big C went to the University of Florida, and that good old boy led his high school in rushing, did the same thing for Florida, and the same thing for the Dallas Cowboys and for the NFL. Not the biggest player, but maybe the biggest heart of all time for the Dallas Cowboys. I want to take you to Rocky Mountain High. I think that was the great John Denver saying that song. Now when they get Rocky Mountain High is for a whole different reason up in Denver, Big C. But when I think about the Denver Broncos, I think about that coldness that the West Coast teams would always go into Denver, and they would freeze. They have a great stadium now. They have one of the prodigal sons as the GM. And I keep thinking, Super Bowl 33, the late Pat Bowen said, "This one's for John." Big C, your thoughts?
Well, the Denver Broncos, we think about the long history and all the tough players who've played up there in the Rocky Mountains, Charlton. Plenty of Hall of Famers that have graced that organization. 2 players come to mind. I think about Steve Atwater, the great safety of the Denver Broncos, who should be in the Hall of Fame, who is not.
Yep.
But John Elway is going to get my nod as the greatest Denver Bronco of all time, Charlton. This is a guy, an exercise in perseverance. 3 Super Bowl losses before he was able to win back-to-back Super Bowls and retire from the NFL.
Yeah, and they were blowout losses. I know they got beat by the 49ers. I think it was 55-10. And Montana, the good old boys, put it on them down in New Orleans. They also had a loss to the Giants, and then they had that big blowout loss. Doug Williams threw for 5 touchdowns in the first half. But John Elway, you're right. He did persevere at Big C. Came back. They had Super Bowl wins over the Green Bay Packers and then also the Atlanta Falcons down in Miami. I want to take you up north. Detroit, Motown. I kind of feel bad for this franchise. They've had so many great players. The Detroit Bad Boys. The Bad Boys were the name for their basketball team. You would have thought it'd be the football team. Give me Big C's thoughts on Joe Louis's town, Big C, the best 2 players in the history of the Lions franchise. Your thoughts?
Well, when you look at where the Detroit Lions are, Charlton, one of the few teams in the NFL that have never made the Super Bowl. But this team has turned out some great players. We think about Megatron, the wide receiver that left the game, early, everybody figured, but in his mind it was time.
It was time.
I think about Lem Barney, the great defensive back, all-pro Hall of Famer, Charlton. But it comes down to Barry Sanders. This man made you miss in a phone booth. He came to magic in football cleats. It was Barry Sanders, the greatest Detroit Lion of all time.
Yeah, and the thing I like about Barry Sanders is he wasn't a big guy. He wasn't built like Jim Brown. And oftentimes people look for the running back that's 6 feet tall or bigger. But oftentimes you'll find the guys, Emmitt Smith, Barry Sanders, they're similar in stature. Sweetness, Walter Payton, and even guys that we have in the league to this day, they have about that same type of frame. So I really appreciate what Sanders was able to do for that great franchise. When you think of the frozen tundra and all of the championships that Lombardi put together with the Green Bay Packers, they were one of the first teams in the NFL to integrate an NFL football team. Really appreciate that. And they're owned by the community, Big C. Give me Big C's thoughts on the top 2 players. And it's a long list, Big C, your thoughts.
Well, the Green Bay Packers, where would you start? When you think about Don Hudson, who still holds the NFL record for yards per catch in NFL history, played with the Green Bay Packers. That's how great he was as a wide receiver. We think about all the great defensive players who played there under Vince Lombardi. But to me, it comes down between 2 quarterbacks. You think about Bart Starr. This man won 5 NFL titles, including the first 2 Super Bowls, Charlton, and he was a 17th round draft pick out of the University of Alabama. Then you come to Brett Favre. Everyone knows about Brett Favre and his history and his record-setting pace he had after coming over in the trade from the Atlanta Falcons. But to me, Bart Starr is still the greatest Green Bay Packer of all time.
Isn't that amazing? I think one of the most touching moments of NFL football was when they had the great Bart Starr, and he had an appearance at a game, and Brett Favre gave him a hug. And that's like, I think Discount Double Check was in the locker room for a halftime. But to me, that will always mean something, because they just paid so much respect to that man, and I appreciate the Packers, and they've always handled themselves with such great class. I want to swing it down south, Big C, to the Houston Texans, number 20 on our list, Big C. And when you think about Houston, you know, it's a newer franchise that came once the Oilers left and became the Titans, and Houston wanted to have a franchise, so they brought their own name. But that's a great state down in Texas. They will always be ancillary to the Dallas Cowboys, but they have their own history and pride. Who would be Big C's thoughts on the top two Houston Texans of all time?
Well, you think about the Houston Texans. They don't have a long history in the NFL, Charlton, but there's a team that has been productive in its time there. Everyone's seeing what Deshaun Watson is doing right now. But to me, when I look at the productivity of this organization, I got to go to J.J. Watt first, Charlton. Is one of the most dominant defensive linemen in the modern era in the NFL. Been a defensive player of the year a couple times in his career. But I look at Andre Johnson, a wide receiver. When this team had no offense, Andre Johnson stood out. One of the most dominant physical wide receivers of his era. I look at him as the greatest Houston Texan of all time.
That's amazing. And also, J.J. Watt, when I think about the flooding they had down in Texas, and it wasn't just him. There were a lot of players, but I know you got a lot of names to come out there and put their names down on the list and help people who were hurt by the flood. So we'll always respect them for that. I want to go to the Colts, the Indianapolis Colts, that we know that they took off. They left town when they were in Baltimore. They left in the middle of the night. They ripped the hearts out of the people of the great city of Baltimore, Big C. But time flies by, and you got to go make new wherever you go. Indianapolis Colts, they have so much history, but it left a lot of history that was at Baltimore, but they made their own history. Give me your thoughts on the top Indianapolis Colts of all time.
Well, you got to make this two franchises, the Baltimore, Indianapolis Colts, Charlton.
Yeah.
You think about the great players of Raymond Berry, Johnny Unitas, Lenny Moore when they were in Baltimore. This was a team played in one of the greatest football games of all time, the game of the decade when they played the New York Giants for the first overtime NFL championship.
Yeah.
They moved to Indianapolis and developed a history in that city, Charlton, led by Peyton Manning, Ezra James, Marvin Harrison, great players. But when I think about the greatest Colts of all time, Charlton, I go with Johnny Unitas. I know a lot of people will say Peyton Manning, but I look at Johnny Unitas. This is a guy who was a free agent, who was cut 4 times before he became a starter in the NFL. And then when he retired, he was the NFL's all-time leading passer.
Isn't that amazing? And Johnny Unitas, everybody talks about, they lost a championship game. They got beaten by the New York Jets when Joe Namath, he gave a guarantee. And Joe Namath is still making commercials, Big C. But yes, the great Johnny Unitas, can't go wrong with him. I want to bring you to another new franchise down south in the great state of Florida. They talk about Jacksonville, the Jacksonville Jaguars. That's a team right now, currently the only NFL team that's owned by a person of color, is Sean Khan. Give me your thoughts on this franchise that was so close yet so far away from the Super Bowl a couple of times. Big C, your thoughts.
This team has put together a host of great players. You think about Jimmy Smith, Keenan McCardle, great set of tandem wide receivers that they had with this organization, Charlton. You think about Mark Brunell, outstanding quarterback who really flourished when he was with this organization. To me, when I think about the top 2 players all time of the Jacksonville Jaguars, there's 2, and they're both on offense. Another offensive lineman, Tony Baselli.
Yeah.
Massive offensive tackle out of USC. His career was cut short because of shoulder injuries. Then I look at Fred Taylor, one of the most underrated running backs during his time in the NFL. Rushed for well over 10,000 yards during his career with the Jacksonville Jaguars.
Yeah, I remember. And Boselli was a stud at USC, and watching Taylor run the ball too. Mark Brunell played at Santa Maria High School St. Joseph High School down in Santa Maria, California, and that's on the coast. And he did a lot of good things at Washington. Split time with Billy Joe Hobart, and they also won a Rose Bowl and split a national championship with Miami. Great program Jacksonville has had for such a young one. I want to jump to number 17 on our list. And when you think about the Kansas City Chiefs, this is one of the more stable programs in the NFL. I mean, some great players that have come out of that franchise. And I think about they've had one of the better tight ends ever in the history of the league, but also some defensive players. I remember meeting Christian Okoye, and he was such a big figure. And imagine how in the world does anyone want to tackle him? But there's a long list. Big C, who are your top two Kansas City Chiefs of all time?
Well, when you look at the Kansas City Chiefs Charlton, was the first NFL team to draft an African-American player, number one overall, Buck Buchanan, defensive tackle out of University of Grambling. They were also the first NFL franchise to start an African-American middle linebacker, Willie Lanier, out of Morgan State. Both of those players are in the NFL Hall of Fame.
Yep.
You think about the great Len Dawson, led them to their only Super Bowl victory against the Minnesota Vikings. But when it comes to the Kansas City Chiefs, and I think about the two greatest players of all time, I look at offense and defense. We think about Tony Gonzalez, who was just inducted into the NFL Hall of Fame. When he retired, he was the best tight end that ever had played in the NFL. Then I go with Derek Thomas. I know a lot of people talk about Lawrence Taylor being the best outside linebacker in NFL history.
Yep.
My nod goes to Derek Thomas as the greatest Kansas City Chiefs and the greatest outside linebacker in NFL history.
I remember talking to Carl Peterson in the locker room in Oakland after a Raider game, when I asked him about his relationship with Al Davis. He said, I have none. I said, well, why not? He said, because Al doesn't want one. Al was so much of a maverick, but a lot of great games between the Chiefs and the Raiders. Really love the way Kansas City has stayed put for the most part, Big C. I want to bring you before the Big C timeout. I want to talk about a team down south in Florida. Beautiful city, Miami, Florida. One of the most beautiful cities in the world. And they happen to have the Miami Dolphins have moved out of Miami. They're now at Fort Lauderdale. A lot of teams have done that. So this franchise, the only one in the history of the NFL to go start to finish without a loss, Big C. I think they even won their preseason games that year. But they've had so many great players. The Sea of Hands out in Oakland, California, that involved the Miami Dolphins. They've had so much to write home about. They had a running back that was a big bruiser, but not big in stature, even though he seemed like it at the time, in the great Larry Csonka, and one of the greatest coaches in the history of the universe. Give me Big C's thoughts on the top two Miami Dolphins of all time.
So many players in this organization history, Charlton, are known. And when you think about it, some of them that are unknown, especially when they had the no-name.
That's right.
But this was an organization, Charlton, in its early years that just dominated the NFL. Everyone knows who Dan Marino is, probably one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time in the NFL who have never won a Super Bowl. But me, as I think of the greatest Miami Dolphin of all time, Charlton, I got to look at Bob Griese. Bob Griese, to me, personified what NFL quarterbacks should be, a true leader. He led his team to 3 different Super Bowls, twice came out victorious, and once, Charlton, became the only undefeated team in NFL history for an entire season.
Isn't that amazing? And we talk about this year, this team was picked by many people to go winless, but because of the heart of the coaching staff and those players that are believing in themselves, they've managed to pull out 3 wins and maybe get 4 before it's all said and done, which is a lot more than Cincinnati that got rid of Marvin Lewis for going to the playoffs 8 times in 9 years. We're going to come up on what's called the Big C timeout, also known as the Big C pause. And as we take that timeout, we're going to come right back to you. I'm going to get Big C's thoughts on some more top players and top teams in the history of the NFL. We'll take the Big C timeout, and we'll be back in just a moment. All right, we're back from the Big C timeout, also known as the Big C pause, and you can follow Big C Sports 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on the #1 podcast network in the universe, iHeartRadio Podcast. You can follow Big C Sports on Apple Podcasts. You can follow Big C Sports on Google Podcasts. The apps that I really love are by Google and Alexa. Just say Google or Alexa, play Big C Sports Podcast. You will hear from our sponsors. You will hear Welcome to the Show. I will introduce Big C as the Mystic, and he'll do his thing. And I really appreciate the way things are going with Big C Sports. You can also follow Big C Sports on Xfinity, Comcast Television, launching on Roku TV, Apple TV, Fire TV, and a lot of smart TVs all over the universe. Also, just want to acknowledge Big C Sports, acknowledged by iHeartRadio Podcast, one of the top apps on the iHeartRadio platform. Big C, I want to take you back to the town of the lakes. I think they say 1,000 lakes in Minnesota, so it must be hard to find a road that doesn't have a lake around it someplace. But the Minnesota Vikings, I think back to the Purple People Eaters. I think back to Alan Page. I think back to Chuck Foreman, that good old boy wore number 44. And, of course, they had a coach that was also a coach up in Canada. But when you think about the Vikings now, they have this beautiful stadium. It looks like a Viking ship. Give me Big C's thoughts on the top 2 Minnesota Vikings of all time.
When you think about a team who really used to play on the frozen tundra, that was the Minnesota Vikings when they played in Metropolitan Stadium in Minneapolis, Charlton. And this team was the first team in NFL history to go to 4 Super Bowls. And that was the Minnesota Vikings. Everyone was synonymous with the Purple People Eaters. You think about Fran Tarkenton and his career with the Minnesota Vikings, hosting that team to a couple different Super Bowls. The offense always dominant. Gene Washington at wide receiver. You talk about Alan Page and Jim Marshall, and who played 21 years on the defensive line. Paul Krause, one of the greatest safeties in NFL history. When he retired, he was the NFL's all-time leading interceptor. We think about the modern players of Randy Moss and Adrian Peterson and what they did in the NFL record books. But to me, when I think about it, I got to go with Paul Krause, who to me is the all-time number 1 Minnesota Viking, Charlton, the safety who led the NFL in interceptions when he retired at 61.
And think about what kept them out of the most recent Super Bowl when they had the highest scoring team in the league. And I remember they missed a field goal, and they kept them out of going down to play in Super Bowl 34 against the Denver Broncos, and Atlanta Falcons witnessed that. But just a great franchise over the many, many years, and arguably one of the best stadiums in the world of the NFL as well. I want to take you out to the great Northeast, Big C. And in the Northeast, you'll find the original 13 colonies. New England Patriots, they are synonymous with championships. They've been to so many championships. You got to start putting championship appearances on your toes with this great franchise. And they have a history. They used to be called the Boston Patriots before they became the New England Patriots. Give me Big C's thoughts on the top 2 Patriots of all time.
Well, when you look at this team, Charlton, it's been identified through offense. Yes, they've had more Super Bowl appearances than any franchise in history. But it starts with offense. You got to look at John Hanna, one of the most dominant offensive guards in NFL history when he was with the New England Patriots. But everybody's going to lean towards Tom Brady, the only quarterback to have made 9 Super Bowl appearances.
Oh, wow. That's 9. And he's still playing. It's not like he retired yet, Big C. I'm sure he's planning on getting back there. I hate that they've had some more discussion about videotape and audio tape. Everybody's cheating at some level, Big C, in the NFL. I mean, that's just the way it is. Even the Rudy Rule is a joke. So as far as if the Patriots are still up to no good, I have no idea. But if you're not cheating, you're not trying, based on some of my friends in Texas that told me that. I want to go to another franchise. And this franchise is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, but they've had some hard luck as a football franchise. The city of New Orleans, I think about Hurricane Katrina, where the Superdome was actually a place that was housing people and a place of refuge, and some of the great athletes and the great food and the great culture of people in New Orleans, and they're really starving for another Super Bowl championship. But give me Big Steve's thoughts on this city that's been through some hard times, but they all congregate around that Superdome. Big Steve, your thoughts?
Well, Charlton, this is an organization that has gone through hard times, and when this situation turned itself around, it was led by a local boy playing quarterback, Bobby Hebert, who came from the USFL when Jim Moore was coaching this team, Charlton, and led them to their first playoff appearance. They drafted an offensive lineman during that time named Willie Roaf. Willie Roaf is now in the NFL Hall of Fame. He blocked for Bobby Hebert, but he also blocked for this player who most likely is the greatest Saint of all time, Drew Brees, who has led New Orleans to their only Super Bowl victory.
Yeah, Drew Brees down in the Big Easy. I like that, Big C. The Drew Brees from the Big Easy, and really appreciate the fans that just flock to that stadium, even in hard times. New Orleans, a great city. And why do they have so many beads, Big C? You got to wear shoes because sometimes you step on beads, Big C. Your thoughts?
Well, it's to help keep your drinks cool, because the ice will melt down and all that humidity.
Yeah, that humidity can do its thing to your eyes. And speaking of humidity, I want to fly you out to the East Coast where you find the mighty New York Giants. Even though they're in New York, they play in New Jersey. And that franchise owned by the Mara family, one of the staples of NFL football. You talked about that great game they had played with the Baltimore Colts back in the day, considered one of the best in the NFL. Also, TV lost coverage on one of those games too, Big C. And the names of stars are as bright as the city of New York. I want to get Big C's thoughts on the top 2 New York Giants of all time.
Well, when you look at this organization, Charlton, they've had 3 different quarterbacks to have won Super Bowls. You've had Phil Simms, you had Jeff Hostetler, you've had Eli Manning. And so this organization has been run through offense in recent times, but I got to take a step back and look at the great defensive players that have played with this organization. Everybody knows about Lawrence Taylor, one of the most dominant defensive players in NFL history.
Oh, yeah.
But before you had highlight sports shows, Charlton, they had another great linebacker. His name was Sam Huff. Sam Huff was the most dominant middle linebacker during his era in the NFL, led the Giants to NFL championships, Charlton. I think of Sam Huff as being the greatest New York Giant of all time.
And I also want to bring up one of the media darlings, the late Frank Gifford, played at Bakersfield High School in California, went to the University of Southern California for the Trojans, and cut his teeth in the NFL in New York City. From Bakersfield to New York City, what a historic rise, and one of the great media mavens also in the world of sports broadcasting. Big C, I want to take you also across the Hudson. I want to go to the New York Jets, Jets. And I know they had arguably the first what they call Hollywood lifestyle player in the great Joe Namath. You know, he used to slap himself and say, thanks, I needed that. He's done commercials with women like the great Farrah Fawcett. You know, he's done so much that brought limelight to that city. But this is a franchise that has been absent of a lot of championships. Big C, give me Big C's thoughts in the Big Apple, the best 2 New York Jets of all time.
Well, I mean, this is a franchise. Charlton has had many great players. Everyone thinks about Joe Namath. You got to look at Curtis Martin, the Hall of Fame running back, Charlton. You got to look at Darrelle Revis, one of the most dominant shutdown corners in NFL history.
Yeah.
But to me, I think about the greatest New York Jet of all time. I think about Don Maynard, a wide receiver. This guy, you know, was cut by Weave Eubank when he was with the Baltimore Colts, and he was a kick returner in the greatest game of all time, and he fumbled the ball, Charlton. He went to Canada, played for a year, came back when Weave Eubank became the Jets head coach.
Yep.
He's also the Jets' all-time leading receiver. This guy was a dominant speedster, Charlton, when he was in the NFL back in the 60s and 70s. Don Maynard, to me, is the number 1 all-time New York Jet.
It's amazing when you talk about Jets can fly. I still think their fans get it right when they go Jets, Jets. I love how they have such involvement in that football team, Big C. They've also played in a couple of stadiums back there in the East Coast, the city. I guess they say if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. They got to start reading that model again, Big C. I want to bring you out to the West Coast for the final year on the West Coast. They'll still be in the West, but the Oakland Raiders, that great silver and black, built like military uniforms. They haven't really changed over the years. They used to have. They still bring out the white jerseys with the gray numbers outlined in black at times, but this is a team. Their franchise, it means so much to the city of Oakland. It means so much to the city of Los Angeles. And they're leaving both to go to the Silver State in Las Vegas, Nevada, Big C. But they have so many players. I think of the Holy Roller because of these good old boys. One of the iconic owners in the history of the universe, the great Al Davis, who also helped in integration and hired an African-American coach before a lot of people would do it. Give me Big C's thoughts on the top 2 Oakland Raiders of all time.
You know, you think about a franchise with a great, rich history, and where do you start with the Oakland Raiders? You know, if I think about a guy who's symbolic of the Raiders, I look at Kenny Stabler. You know, I could see Kenny walking around with the patch over his eye playing a game.
Yeah.
Think about Ted Hendricks, the Mad Stork, Howie Long, great defensive lineman, Charlton, looked like a model even when he played. You know, you think about Jack Tatum. Jack Tatum would have been fined and kicked out of every NFL game today if he was playing, and he only played 9 years in the NFL.
Yep.
Gene Upshaw, one of the most dominant offensive guards of his era. But when I look at the Raiders, Charlton, there's 2 players that come to mind to me. I think about old man Willie Brown. Everybody remembers him from the Super Bowl interception return in 1977 against the Minnesota Vikings, where he took it to the house against Fran Tarkenton. But the Mr. Raider himself, Jim Otto, Double O, played through every injury you could ever imagine as a football player, Charlton. The Oakland Raiders' all-time great player, center Jim Otto.
Yeah, I remember meeting John Vella. I interviewed him. He was opening up Raider locker room over in the East Bay, and these guys were big men, but they had tears in their eyes when the Raiders were coming back from Southern California to Oakland. Just love that franchise, and I wish them nothing but the best as they go to the city of sin. What a sin it is to leave California, Big C. Speaking of a city where they boo Santa Claus because I don't know why you boo Santa Claus. It doesn't make any sense. The city of brotherly love. Rocky made it famous for boxing, Big C, and the Eagles are so beloved. They have so much of an appreciation for football in that city. They also play at a great football stadium. So whether it's football, basketball, or baseball, Philadelphia really is a city of brotherly love. But give me Big C's thoughts on a team that's come up short so many times in the Super Bowl, but they'll get over the hump. They got over it once. They may get over it again, but not this year. Who are the best two Philadelphia Eagles of all time? Big C, your thoughts?
Well, a lot of great players in the history of this organization. You think about Wilbert Montgomery, Harold Carmichael, great offensive players in this time with this organization. Randall Cunningham cut his teeth. Ron Jaworski took them to their first Super Bowl. But when it comes down to the two greatest Eagles of all time, Charlton, Donovan McNabb at quarterback, still the Eagles' all-time leading passer. Not many people realize that he has more passing yards than Troy Aikman did in his NFL career. But then I got to look at the Minister of Defense, Reggie White.
Oh, yeah.
Reggie White, symbolic of the heart and soul of the city of Philadelphia. Philadelphia's Eagles' all-time greatest player, Reggie White.
And I still want to go also to Donovan McNabb, and he had Terrell Owens, and Terrell Owens was playing with a bummed ankle, some said a fractured ankle, but I still remember how he played in the Super Bowl, and he was really banged up, Big C. But that city of Philadelphia, they really love their sports, and that's why they boo if you're not happy with your performance. I want to stay to the East Coast in the same state. In Pennsylvania, you have the Steel Curtain. It's something about that team, and I still think the ball touched the ground with the immaculate reception, Big C. And some people call it a conception because the Raiders get screwed, no pun intended, Big C. It's all fair in love and war, and it's amazing how when the Rooney family was going down the escalator, that's when the immaculate reception happened. So the owner really did get to see it, but it's forever shaped NFL football and the controversies. Was it a play? Was it not a play? Was it a catch? Not a catch? Offensively, defensively, there's so many great players for this franchise. Who's Big C's thoughts on the top two Steelers of all time?
Where do you begin with the Pittsburgh Steelers when you think about the Steel Curtain of that era, Charlton? All the great players, Mel Blount, Jack Lambert on defense. You look at the offense that they had, Rocky Bleier, Franco Harris, John Stallworth, Lynn Swann. But, as I think of the heart and soul of the Pittsburgh Steelers during that era, Charlton, I got to look at Joe Green on defense. He was the first draft pick of Chuck Noll in his starting building of that franchise. And he didn't let it down, Charlton. One of the greatest dominant defensive tackles of his era in pro football. But to me, the greatest Steeler of all time, I got to look at quarterback Terry Bradshaw. Still today, the only man in NFL history to go 4 for 4 in the Super Bowl, Charlton. Yeah,
and Terry Bradshaw still doing his thing in TV. He's been in movies. He's really been a Hollywood figure for that beautiful franchise in Pittsburgh. And even Mean Joe, when you think about young kids liking football players now, Mean Joe, when he had to drink, I think it was Coke or a Pepsi. I guess that advertiser didn't. I don't know if it's Coke or a Pepsi, but I know he drank it. And he gave the jersey to that little kid. So even back then, Big C, they were reaching out to the youth that will make the NFL's future fans really appreciate the Pittsburgh Steelers and Mean Joe and what he did, and of course Terry Bradshaw as well. I want to take you to the West and also Midwest. The number 7 on our pick, Los Angeles and St. Louis Rams. I'm telling you, there's so much about the arch in St. Louis that crosses right by the Mississippi River, and now they're coming where there's more water to the West Coast. They started in L.A., they moved to the Midwest, and now they're back in L.A. I still remember these Rams games that they would have against the 49ers. and it's great to see football back in LA. Now they're moving into new digs again. Big C, your thoughts? The best two players of all time.
Well, when you look at the history of the Rams, Charlton, I mean, this is illustrious history of great dominant players. I mean, as you look on the landscape, people think of Eric Dickerson, one of the most dominant running backs in the first 4 years of his NFL career. Matter of fact, the greatest first 4 years in NFL history. You think about Marshall Faulk, greatest show on turf. Kurt Warner, who led him to back-to-back Super Bowl victories, Charlton. The Minister of Defense, Deacon Jones, who I still think today is the greatest defensive end to have ever played in our great game. But a player who flies under the radar, who played more games at offensive tackle than any player in NFL history. That's Jackie Slater, Charlton. This man played 20 years as a starter for the L.A. Rams and St. Louis Rams as an offensive lineman and played at an all-pro level. His son now plays with the New England Patriots. Matter of fact, he blocked a punt against the Kansas City Chiefs and also the Los Angeles Rams to help win the last Super Bowl. But Jackie Slater, to me, is the greatest Los Angeles Ram of all time.
I don't think many people would disagree with that at all, Big C. Really love their colors, that blue and gold, and every now and then they have the throwback uniforms, the white and blue that they started with back in the day. And I want to take it to another team that's also now the Los Angeles Chargers, but they're San Diego also, even though they started in Los Angeles. So they come back to where they started. This is a proud franchise. I remember Eric Coryell's show, Just Pass It, 4th and goal on the 1-yard line, pass it. He didn't care what down it was. Also, the Holy Roller, they blame the Raiders for cheating them in that game, Big C, and I agree with them. From Dan Fouts to Winslow, I thought I saw one of the better playoff games against the Miami Dolphins. Give me your thought on the team that plays in the smallest NFL franchise stadium. Does it make any sense for them to get new digs next year? The best two Chargers of all time, your thoughts?
Well, when you think about this team, Charlton, this team has had a rich history of offense. If you go back to Bambi, Lance Allworth, great wide receiver out of the University of Arkansas. John Hadle, the quarterback. You talked about Dan Fouts, the great passer, Charlton, out of the University of Oregon. Chuck Muncie, the running back out of Cal. Charlie Joyner, Hall of Fame wide receiver. You think about LaDainian Tomlinson, one of the most dominant offensive running backs in NFL history, Charlton. But I got to look at the great Junior Seau, one of the all-time great linebackers out of USC, Charlton. Perennial All-Pro, 20 seasons in the NFL.
Amazing.
At an all-pro pace at linebacker for the Chargers, Charlton. Junior Seau, greatest Charger of all time.
And I don't think many people would disagree with that at all. I want to bring it back up north, Big C. California is known as the Golden State because of gold and also because the land is golden, Big C, but the 49ers, they're starting to earn it. They want it so bad. They want another gold ring, Big C, with diamonds on it this time. The San Francisco 49ers, we think back to the days that they played at Kezar Stadium in San Francisco. Now a lot of high school players play at Kezar Stadium. I'll never forget Candlestick Park. That place would roar down there at Hunters Point in San Francisco. Now they're in new digs in Levi Stadium, Santa Clara, California. They've had so many great coaches and players, from ownership to coaches. Hall of Famers galore. Big C's thoughts on the top two 49ers of all time.
Well, you think about R.C. Owens and Joe Perry there at Kezar Stadium, along with John Brody, Charlton, as his franchise progressed on over the years. But so many people think about the modern San Francisco 49ers and what they did and the legacy under Bill Walsh. And you look at the great players that they had in that organization, Charlton. You think about Steve Young, Jerry Rice, who statistically is the greatest receiver to ever put on an NFL uniform. But I like Joe Montana. This is the trigger man, Charlton, who set this franchise apart in the NFL running that West Coast offense. I think Joe Montana is the greatest San Francisco 49er of all time.
I remember when I was a young boy, I met Gene Washington, and I would proudly say that Candlestick Park was the only NFL stadium that I snuck into as a little boy, so that also made me like the 49ers. I thought NFL football for free, it's always fun and love and war, Big C. I want to keep it on the West Coast. Going way up north, one of the newer franchises in the NFL, the Seattle Seahawks, number 4 on our list. And when you think about how beautiful that city is, known as the Emerald City, they have football, basketball, and baseball. Little known story about the Seattle Seahawks. They were on their way out of town. They had the Kingdome, and it was just falling down, literally falling down on people, Big C. And they had a vote in King County, and they were about to leave too. That vote passed by 51-49, and they built a new stadium, Questfield. They've named it different things, but it's amazing. That's a great city also with some great players, from Steve Largent, the great Brian Bosworth. I remember Bo Jackson ran all the way into the locker room. He was running so fast on that turf. Big C, give me your thoughts on the greatest two Seattle Seahawks of all time.
This franchise has had many great players. You talked about Steve Largent, Jim Zorn, who was throwing the ball to him, Kenny Easley, one of the greatest NFL safeties of all time out of UCLA, Charlton. This team has built a legacy of dominant players. You think about they went to a Super Bowl years ago in Detroit, lost to the Pittsburgh Steelers. That team was led by Sean Alexander, who set an NFL single-season rushing record for touchdowns.
Yeah.
But as everybody knows what Russell Wilson has done in his first 8 years in the NFL, Walter Jones, who led the rush for the Seattle Seahawks, great offensive tackle, Charlton, who blocked for Sean Alexander, who set that NFL rushing record, and also Matt Hasselbeck, in getting the Seattle Seahawks to their first Super Bowl. I think that Sean Jones is the greatest Seattle Seahawk of all time.
And it's a beautiful city, and they have the oldest coach right now in the NFL, the great Pete Carroll. I want to take you far south, Big C, to the city of Tampa in the state of Florida, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I remember the great Doug Williams and how dominant of a person he was out of Grambling State. And I remember as an African-American quarterback, people kept asking him, so what's it like to be a black quarterback? Now it seems the black quarterbacks dominate most of the categories in the top 10 of the NFL. But he also went on to set an NFL Super Bowl record, 5 touchdown passes in the first half when he played for the Washington Redskins. But I want to get your thoughts on this great franchise that's had a new stadium built also. Give me Big C's thoughts on the top 2 Tampa Bay Buccaneers of all time.
This was an organization that started its career in futility, Charlton. It took them a year and a half before they won their first NFL game. But after they did that, Charlton, they were led by one of the greatest players that ever played in their organization, their first number one overall draft pick, Leroy Selman, Charlton. You think about the history of this organization over time, went on to win a Super Bowl under John Gruden. They were led by Derrick Brooks, a linebacker, Charlton, and a great defense at that time. But to me, still, the greatest Tampa Bay Buccaneer of all time is Leroy Selman, defensive end out of University of Oklahoma and NFL Hall of Famer.
Not many people would disagree. Going down to the great state of Texas, Houston Oilers, they wanted to be number 1, and Bum said, we knocked on the door, and next time we're going to kick the daggone thing in, Big C, but they never quite got the door kicked in. Them good old boys down in Houston with the powder blue uniforms. I've always liked that stadium. I'm telling you, there's something about franchises that close shop and go out of state, and that happened to that great franchise. And you can never forget how beautiful it was when the lights would be down in Texas in that beautiful stadium that's still standing outside of the new stadium for the Texans. Give me Big C's thoughts on the top 2 Houston Oilers of all time.
Great organization, Charlton. When you think about defensive back Ken Riley, who played there, this was an organization with Elvin Bethea, Hall of Fame defensive end. These kids came out of historical black colleges, Charlton. Everybody knows who Earl Campbell is.
Yep.
The Tyler Rose, Charlton. Everybody remembers that memorable run that he had on Monday night. But I go back to the number 1 Houston Oiler of all time. I think of another offensive lineman who spent 20 years blocking in the NFL. And you think about 20 years doing anything, especially pounding on another road grade on the other side of the ball.
Yep.
Bruce Matthews played guard for the Houston Oilers for 20 years and also the Tennessee Titans, Charlton, out of the University of USC. Great all-pro Hall of Fame offensive lineman.
Oh, it's amazing, Big C. We want to finish strong with our nation's capital. And when you think about the Washington Redskins, I remember RFK Stadium. I remember guys like Sonny Jurgensen, even like the great John Riggins and Theismann throwing the football. There's so much history in that stadium. I remember they had the Hogs, Big C. That's like the Hogs in Washington, D.C. Well, they had them in the football linemen. They've always played with the backdrop of the nation's capital. So it's always meant something to watch the Washington Redskins perform where every president could watch them play. Give me Big C's thoughts on the top 2 Washington Redskins of all time.
3 Super Bowl victories, Charlton, 3 different quarterbacks, 4 appearances in the Super Bowl. The Washington Redskins one of the most dominant teams in the NFC East. And you think about the rich history of players who played there. You talked about Sonny Jurgensen, who's in the NFL Hall of Fame at quarterback. Joe Theismann, who's in the NFL Hall of Fame at quarterback. You talk about those great offensive linemen that they had, Charlton, throughout their time. But I go to two great players, Charlton, on both sides of the ball with the Washington Redskins. I think about Art Monk.
Oh, yeah.
When he retired, Charlton, from the NFL, he was the NFL's all-time leading receiver.
Wow.
In yards and receptions. Took him 19 years to get into the NFL Hall of Fame, even with those great accomplishments. But then I'm going to finish up with a defensive back, Charlton, who was always underrated in his career. Spent 19 years covering NFL wide receivers. Think about that, 19 years, Charlton.
That's a lot.
He played at an all-pro level. Darrell Green out of Texas A&I, historical black college, Charlton, the greatest Washington Redskin of all time.
I love the segment that we just did, and again, everybody has their own opinion about what Kool-Aid tastes better, who the best players are, but I love bringing it to you on Big C Sports. You can follow Big C Sports 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on the #1 podcast network in the universe, iHeartRadio Podcast. You can follow Big C Sports on Apple Podcasts. You can follow Big C Sports on Google Podcasts. You can follow Big C Sports on my two favorite apps called Google and Alexa. Just say Google or Alexa, play Big C Sports Podcast. You will hear from our sponsors. You will hear welcome to the show. I will introduce Big C as the Mystic, and he'll do his thing. And I really appreciate the way things are going with Big C Sports. You can also follow Big C Sports on Xfinity, Comcast Television, launching on Roku TV, Apple TV, Fire TV, and a lot of smart TVs all over the universe. I want to finish up our segment in the final 5 minutes, Big C. Sunday Night Football, Buffalo Bills, Pittsburgh Steelers game. It will be a special moment for the Edmonds family. Bills linebacker Tremaine Edmonds, Steelers safety Terrell Edmonds, and Steelers running back Trey Edmonds will be on the field, and that will make them the first trio of brothers to play in the same game in the National Football League in 92 years. Big C, your thoughts?
Well, Charlton, you think about the opportunity to have a chance to play with your brothers on the same field in any sport. Think about high school, even college. But this is being done in the NFL. First time since, in 92 years?
Yeah, 92 years. Yeah.
You know, you talk about proud parents, Charlton, the Edmonds parents being able to have their sons, and being, you got to wear that two-sided jerseys. You got two sons playing for the Steelers in this game. So I guess it's, 2/3 of the jersey will be about the Steelers. But their dad was a two-time All-Pro, Charlton, tight end with the Miami Dolphins back in the early 90s, rather. So when you think about the lineage, everyone talks about the first family of football where they always want to say the Mannings.
Yeah.
People forget about how difficult it is to get into this league. We know that the Watts brothers have played TJ and JJ in the NFL as well as Gronkowski.
Yeah.
But never before, Charlton, have three brothers up in 92 years played together in the same game in the NFL.
Yeah, I know. We talk so much about just the likeliness of knowing how another person thinks and then having them play in that same profession and then dominate at that profession is also. The last time three brothers all played in the same NFL game, I believe it was 1927 when Joe Rooney and Cobb Rooney and Bill Rooney all played for the Duluth Eskimos. Big C, your thoughts?
Well, I guess it was kind of cold during that time, dropping the Eskimos. Yeah. I thought they were up in Canada playing up there, but yep. Duluth now, you think about that, having a team in the NFL named Duluth.
Yep.
And that's how the NFL has grown, Charlton, in the last 92 years.
Yeah, the 92 years. And still growing. We know it's the greatest. It really is the greatest sport out there. I know a lot of people love it. I love bringing Big C Sports to the sports universe. We talk about NFL and going back in time and really just thinking about how blessed we are to have the names of so many great players that have entertained us for over the years. Big C, back in the day, there was a man by the name of Drew Boudini Brown. He was known as Muhammad Ali's right-hand man, and he would always tell Ali, with all you got to use, how can you lose? Rumble, young man, rumble. Big C, what are you looking forward to in the sports universe?
Well, Charlton, as we pay homage to our great military veterans every day as we begin our show, we're going to begin this weekend on Saturday with paying homage to our great military youth. When the Army-Navy annual game in the Lincoln in Philadelphia is played, Charlton, it will be the only game on Saturday that's played in college football But this game means more than just college football, Charlton. This is a game about life.
Yeah.
Where many of these young men, Charlton, will never play another game of football after that. But they will go on to serve our great country with honor and dignity in protecting the lives of Americans every day.
And we love bringing it to them. We love paying homage to them. And we love bringing it to the sports universe. You can bring it to them, too, every Monday through Friday at 5 and 6 p.m. worldwide when you follow Big C Sports on the Big C Sports Network, on the #1 network in the United States of America. And Big C Sports has been voted the #1 sports show in the universe, according to Big C and them good old boys down south. As we always tell you, there's never, ever an excuse for domestic violence. If you know any man or woman going through that garbage, please pick up the phone and call 911, because no man or woman should ever have to go through that garbage on their own. And as we always tell you on every Big C Sports show, we thank you, we appreciate you, and we hope that you have a super fantastic day.